The U.S. Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments on a case that could have broad implications for immigration policy. President Trump wants to end birthright citizenship, and tomorrow, the nation's highest court takes on a case that may allow him to move forward. The Hill's courts and legal reporter Zach Schoenfeld joins us to discuss. Hey, Zach, so ultimately Trump wants to limit citizenship only to people who have at least one U.S. citizen or permanent resident parent. No more anchor babies, as Trump might describe them. Seems to fly in the face of the 14th Amendment, but that's not exactly what's going to be argued tomorrow.
Yeah, that's right, Drew. Instead, what's before the Supreme Court at this stage of the case is when these lower courts, when they have found that Trump's executive order likely violates the 14th Amendment, were they proper to block his order not only for the parties who are actually suing in court, but going ahead and blocking the policy across the country. And that's the current state of play. As of right now, Trump's executive order cannot be enforced anywhere nationwide. So the Trump administration is now taking this to the Supreme Court, and they have tried to make very clear to the justices that they're not, making that 14th Amendment argument quite yet. Instead, they just want the justices to step in here to allow the administration to partially enforce its order in some parts of the country.
Yeah, so if the Supreme Court blocks the nationwide injunction from being enacted while this challenge to birthright citizenship plays out, would people born during that interim period not be citizens? It seems like that could be a problem if ultimately the court deems Trump's effort to be unconstitutional.
Yeah, it could really end up in a bit of a messy scenario, because if the Trump administration gets what it wants here at this stage of the case, what it would mean is that in some states, for the Democratic-led states that have been suing, Trump's birthright citizenship order will be blocked there. It'll also be blocked for several individuals who have been suing in court, also the members of several immigration and other organizations that are suing. But it would allow the administration to enforce its order in those red states for people who are not part of those organizations. So really, in terms of when this order would apply, the short answer is it depends on where you live and if you're a member of this organization. But as you point out there, it really could create a messy scenario where, if the Trump administration gets a win here, but then eventually the case comes back to the Supreme Court and they rule that this order is unconstitutional, the courts will have to figure out what to do with those folks.
And it's not just this case. It seems like what the Supreme Court decides here on the nationwide injunction issue would have pretty broad implications.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're seeing this nationwide injunction issue play out not only here in the birthright citizenship context, not even just in immigration cases, but in many of these dozens upon dozens of lawsuits that have been filed against the Trump administration. We've seen that, for example, there's a nationwide injunction in effect right now blocking Trump's, that was in effect blocking Trump's transgender troops ban. The Supreme Court stepped in to lift that ruling. There have been various nationwide injunctions related to federal funding freezes. So you name it, this really has broad implications, and whatever the Supreme Court decides here is really going to have ripple effects through those dozens of cases as they make their way through the lower courts.
So when will the Supreme Court actually get around to the issue of whether or not Trump can end birthright citizenship?
It's a bit unclear at this point, but all the legal experts who I've been talking to do agree that at some point the Supreme Court is probably going to have to answer that question. But at least at this point of the case, this is still in the emergency stage of the case. This is not going through the normal process, so it still could be some time before the Supreme Court takes up that consequential issue of the 14th Amendment. Now, it might not be too long. The courts have been, working through these cases at a pretty decent speed, so there's a chance that it could get there next term, but the exact timing at this point, like I said, just remains a bit unclear.
What do court watchers think about this injunction issue? Seems like if the Supreme Court were to rule with the Trump administration here, it could unleash a good amount of chaos across the country.
Yeah, you really see legal scholars come down on both sides of this issue. Obviously right now we're seeing the Trump administration really complain about nationwide injunctions. They're not the first to complain. When the Biden administration was in office, they were complaining about nationwide injunctions. Actually, in the final few months of the Biden administration, they had urged the Supreme Court to take up this issue of limiting nationwide injunctions. The court refused to get involved. So this is not necessarily a left versus right issue. Really what we see is presidential administrations when they're in power, don't like nationwide injunctions, but when you're in the minority and have no political levers to play in Washington, we tend to see plaintiffs like nationwide injunctions. And so the question becomes for the justices, we've really seen a rise in nationwide injunctions in the last decade or so, whether they're going to allow that to continue or whether they want to rein in that practice, because as some legal scholars argue, these types of injunctions that go beyond the parties who are actually suing in court, they argue exceeds the federal court's authority.
Switching gears a bit here, a federal judge has said the Trump administration can use the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Tren de Agua gang members. That's in opposition to other federal court rulings saying the Trump administration was using the Alien Enemies Act improperly. So where do we stand now across the country?
Yeah, it's been a patchwork of cases because the Supreme Court has ruled that when migrants want to challenge their removals under the Alien Enemies Act, they need to do so through a proceeding called habeas. Those cases have to be brought where they are actually physically detained. So we've seen the American Civil Liberties Union, they have been filing a wave of cases filed on behalf of migrants detained all across the country. So we've now seen several district judges try to work through these cases. And as you teed up there in the question, yesterday was the first time that we saw one of these judges back the administration, saying that when Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act, that he was allowed to do so to deport these Tren de Aragua members. We've seen several other district judges in other cases go the other way and say that the Alien Enemies Act, requires either a wartime or some actual armed invasion, and not the sort of claims that Trump has been making here when it comes to Tren de Aragua. But it really has caused a patchwork of cases across the country. So depending if you're, are a migrant who could be removed under the Alien Enemies Act, depending on where you're detained and depending on the judge who got your case, the results look very different for you right now.
In her ruling, U.S. District Judge Stephanie Haynes said that potential deportees must be given 21 days notice and an opportunity to be heard. Sounds a lot like due process. Isn't that basically what Democrats have been saying?
Yeah, that really becomes the next question. So if a judge rules that Trump did properly invoke the Alien Enemies Act and can use that law, the next question becomes, what due process do migrants have to be given before they're actually taken out of the country? The Trump administration has sought to give migrants very little notice. They have at times suggested perhaps just 12 hours or 24 hours notice is sufficient to comply with the Supreme Court's previous emergency ruling, which said that they need some sort of notice and an opportunity to be heard. But really, these judges have been having to grapple with the question of just exactly how much notice is enough notice. So we've now seen this judge saying that 21 days is needed, but this is a question that seems that it's going to be continued to be litigated, and that question, too, could ultimately reach the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and the ACLU still wants the Supreme Court to weigh in on this issue. What exactly are they asking?
Yeah, the ACLU has told the Supreme Court, they've said, look at all these cases that are proceeding across the country. And, you can let them continue to percolate, and we're going to, in the ACLU's view, could continue to get these series of rulings. But they have asked the Supreme Court to go ahead and pluck the cases out of the lower courts and to go ahead and provide a nationwide resolution on these issues of whether President Trump can invoke the Alien Enemies Act to deport Tren de Aragua members. The ACLU, wants the Supreme Court to provide this resolution so they don't have to keep litigating. Almost a dozen cases now have been filed across the country, but it would be a break with the normal procedure. Normally, the Supreme Court likes to let cases go through the normal process in the lower courts so they can see how judges grapple with these complex legal issues to help them better inform their decision if and when this issue ultimately gets to the high court. But at least as of now, we have not yet heard from the justices of what they're going to do here and whether they're going to pluck it out of the lower courts and take up this issue now.
Seems like the Trump administration might actually have some heartburn over this ruling, too. I mean, it's been their argument that there are tens of millions of illegal immigrants they want to deport, and giving them all hearings would make that impossible.
Yeah, that's the basic argument that the Trump administration has been making in all of these cases, saying that if you side with the ACLU and give these migrants all of this due process that the ACLU has been asking for, that you're talking about with just the number of migrants out there, that you're just talking about an untenable situation. But at least as of now, the Trump administration has told the Supreme Court they don't want them to get involved. They want the Supreme Court to turn away this request from the ACLU and let these cases go through the lower courts. Now we'll see, like I said, down the road, the Trump administration could still ask the Supreme Court to get involved, but at least as of now, they want the justices to stay out of it.
All right, we'll leave it at that. If you're interested in these court issues, head over to thehill.com. You can follow Zach's newsletter, The Gavel, for all your latest legal and courts news. Zach Schoenfeld, thanks so much.
Thanks, Drew.